Okay, thank you very much, Rob. Um, my topic is on alternative assessment and tertiary level academic English in the Creole/global context. And my reason for choosing that title is because I recognize that very often we speak about a specific context, but the strategies and the um, the technology is applicable even to a wider space. So I became, so I'm a lecturer in linguistics and TESOL at the University of the West Indies and founder of Action TESOL Caribbean. And I'm interested in this whole idea of teaching academic English or academic literacies in a different way, particularly because when I had the opportunity, I no longer teach academic English, I teach research, but it is a form of English for specific, well, English for academic purposes. I became interested because I recognized that around, let's say 2004, when the tertiary sector began to expand, many institutions were practicing what I call isomorphism. They were trying to copy the content and the pedagogy of institutions that were more established in their practice. And this is something that persists. And when I have had the opportunity to speak to teachers, I recognize that they know a lot of information. They have a lot of information about methodology and context and so, but actually applying their linguistic knowledge or their education knowledge at times is challenging. So I'm just giving a roadmap. So I'll reflect a little bit on the sectoral expansion, some discussion about learner characteristics in our context, teacher ideologies, best practices according to Brian Morgan, and some reiterations at the end. So this timeline basically shows that the government began with an education for all policy in 2000, and it became, I should say, system-wide. They started with secondary, then they went to tertiary, then they went to early childhood, not necessarily in a progressive order, but there was a domino effect from the elimination of the common entrance exam. And I think that this would have happened also in the Caribbean, where the tertiary sector began to swell as a result of less elitism in school placement and less, I should say, elitism even in the tertiary sector. So what happened is that the government introduced government assistance tuition, a government assistance for tuition expenses, that's GATE. And also in the interim, they also constructed many more secondary schools. Now, I don't have all statistics for all the institutions, but I selected this actually out of a study that I did in 2010 that really focused more on the students' response to alternative assessment. But I thought that for this purpose, I wanted to talk about more the rationale and give an example of alternative assessment. So basically, what I'm saying is that even though there's economic downturn and there has been talk about lowered enrollment, what I did note, and even from speaking to teachers in a recent curriculum review, is that the organizations that are considered to be tertiary institutions of learning, they seem to continue to absorb the population coming out of secondary school. And that's because no, let's say GCSE or CAPE, which is our equivalent A levels, will be required at certain institutions. So I'm suggesting, especially in our COVID-19 situation, that 2020 students will still continue to enroll in these institutions, but also there will be perhaps more competition, particularly because of all the constraints that have been imposed upon us. But also, I believe learners will also become more discerning about where, for example, they can have a positive experience as learners. So it's also important to think about alternative assessment, particularly for the online context, as well as for the context that continues to absorb non-traditional learners. So academic literacy in the Creole context has a few characteristics or let's say language learning on the whole. And one of the things is that there's a narrow distance between, let's say, the Creole and the Standard, and also hybrid culture. And this narrow distance means that learners are culturally close to English. In addition, typologically, especially in Trinidad, where we have a medium Creole, there isn't such a great distinction between the Creole and Standard in some features. You can even find Standard English features in our Creole. In fact, recently, an editor looking at some data that I had presented asked me, is this really Creole? And I had to explain because she was from another Caribbean island. But what this does is that it impacts motivation where language learning is concerned. And this comes back to this whole idea of deficit and liberationist. So what I have done is it mirrors the discussion that took place between Cook and Catrue on the global scale. And yes, there are approaches, for example, or a lot of the traditional approaches have been to focus on what learners can do, highlighting their unique features. And this research is still very important because it helps teachers put a name to, what they might be addressing in their practice. I also classified some as variationists who talk a lot about accommodating and integrating Creole into their teaching practice. So some of these theorists are Caribbean people abroad who have studied in the Caribbean, who have studied the Caribbean context. And then there's a group of transformationists, a term that I'm applying to persons like Suresh Kananaraja, who will be more widely known internationally, and Beverly Bryant, who's a Jamaican. And I dare say, even some of our colleagues who are here at EFLtalks can fit into this category of transformationists, like Paulette, for example. In addition, I speak also of Creole lobbyists who don't really lobby for complete use of Creole in the education context, but they lobby for the use of Creole and the rights of Creole speakers in social domains. And all of these perspectives are important to embracing Creole culture as part of language teaching. So what I'm proposing is that the transformative pedagogy really may require taking some of what is the old hat and looking at it from a different perspective, valuing learner autonomy, for example, not necessarily seeing the learner always as, I should say, a subject for error analysis. Also looking at patterns and cycles within the learner's discourse, something that I have done in my classes, using errors to actually reconstruct a curriculum that would be suitable as an alternative to the institutionalized curriculum and still achieve the goals, the overarching goals. And then looking at learners as texts themselves. They have a worldview, a habit of mind, a story that unifies their experience. And this is also very important to take on board. So in terms of best practice, Brian Morgan is suggesting, and he suggested this for teacher education, but I see it also as important for being applied to alternative assessment with some adjustments that I've made. For example, looking at institutionalized power relations, textual patterns, not only for the student, but also those institutionalized patterns as well, considering all of those, the multimodal resources, including the oral, which you will see as what I gave an example of, and also teachers and students as text, because teachers also have their story. I remember reading an article which really inspired me. It talked about middle-class teachers with a middle-class pedagogy, teaching at middle-class institutions to learners who have middle-class aspirations. And that's perhaps a perspective that can be imposed if a teacher is not careful to step back and assess the learner characteristics. And this is exactly what happens in the case of the isomorphism that I've spoken about. So it's important for learners to be seen as active meaning makers. So I just give an example of a personal essay that I use. Now, narrative is not necessarily used in English for academic purposes generally. at the tertiary level. It might be mentioned just to distinguish it from expository writing, but I found it was very useful that a group of learners, mature adults, persons who had no English qualification, and you find that at smaller institutions, I was able to use proverbs as a platform for beginning a narrative and to impose, I should say impose, but by guidelines, allow the learners to explore structure without being thrown into expository writing, especially if they come from an oral tradition or an oral discourse background. And instead of focusing on, let's say for the Creole context, voice becomes very important when you have two codes. Authenticity is important because very often learners would say that they learn off the expository model, and learning off, of course, does not lead to authentic writing. And of course, things like sentence fluency, not necessarily in the traditional way, but even if you use fragments and you use them with a certain license, and you can justify, it's not about always correcting and always conforming to the institutional model. This is an example of a, I would say, a learner evaluation sheet that I used with adult learners, and they had a lot of fun, and their ages actually were sometimes over 40. And they love the idea of being able for themselves to say at the beginning of a diagnostic, I can do these things well, or I can't. And with each, I didn't have to say it to them afterwards because it was part of their portfolio that they would auto evaluate. And this is important because very often rubrics come from the teacher, they're very writer oriented, and they don't engage with this, this idea of metacognition, this idea of reflection that the learner can do. So I really wanted, for the purpose of the talk, to leave actually the idea of transformative pedagogy that is rooted in the Creole space, but is also relevant to the global space. And to end, I just wanted to highlight that, you know, we are post-method, but I also believe that our COVID situation is going to perhaps impose post-COVID as terminology that teachers might actually take on board, because it actually is so transformative by necessity in terms of all of the challenges and all of the resources that teachers and learners have had to draw on. And again, in this transformative context, the social context is very important to consider, as well as institutionalized power relations and constraints. Even though there have been situations of inequality before COVID, I believe in this context, I think things like digital literacy and access to technology have also surfaced as issues to be considered. I think personal meaning and also cognizance of teacher ideologies and learner ideologies are also very important. So I just want to leave you with this quote, that liberation education is not a direct instruction phenomenon, and the best we can do is work to create the conditions under which students will begin to take the initiative to transform their thinking, their learning, our society. And in the process, as teachers, we learn a lot. Thank you.